All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here for this year's Sea Airspace Manpower Panel. What the Navy League has asked us to do here today is have a bit of a conversation around the general proposition that you know, partly because of advances in technology, the way we do training and the way we're going to do training 5 years from now is probably very different than how we did it 5 years ago. And if you were here on Monday, I think you heard CNO say a couple of times that one of the drivers of that evolution is the fact that we've learned an enormous amount about the process of learning and the science of learning over the past several years. And I took that to mean a couple of things, and our panelists will correct me if this is the wrong framing of this, but I think it means a couple things. One is the idea of putting somebody in a C school for a few weeks and just force-feeding them PowerPoint slides ad infinitum is probably not the optimal way that most people learn. And the second is there's a huge amount of variation person to person in how people learn and the pace at which people learn. So because of that, you need to have tools to measure people's aptitudes at different stages in their career and give them training, as the Navy would say, when it's relevant, ready and relevant. So that's kind of the framing mechanism I wanted to use for this. You know, training needs to be appropriate to where people are in their careers and maybe deliver that in smaller, more relevant bites. And I think our folks are going to talk about how they're moving in that direction. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists. We have with us Rear Admiral John Nowell, who's the Director of Military Personnel Plans and Policy in the CNP's office. Brigadier General Calvert Worth, Commanding General of Marine Corps Training Command. Rear Admiral Brian Penoyer, the Commander of FORSCOM at the Coast Guard. And actually, a last-minute substitution. Your programs probably reflect that we were expecting the superintendent of the Merchant Marine Academy, Admiral Buono. He had to cancel at the last minute, unfortunately. Michael Morris, the Director of Total Force Management at Military Sealift Command, was good enough to join us at the last minute to substitute, so we appreciate that. With that, just a couple words on formatting here. I've asked each of our panelists to give us some opening remarks here in about 10 minutes or less each. After that, we'll move as quickly as possible to audience questions, so once we get toward the end of these opening remarks, feel free to approach these microphones here, and if I see people at those posts, I will move directly to you more or less, and if not, I'll have questions of my own. But that's the general format. Admiral Nowell, you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here, and certainly great to see some old shipmates in the audience. We've been on a journey since about 2015 to update not just the way that we're delivering training, but also how we are managing our talent. And as in 2015, Admiral Moran at the time was our Chief of Naval Personnel, and he started us on a journey with an initiative called Sailor 2025, and it's about modernizing our personnel system. It's about improving our training. Again, we call that ready, relevant learning, as Jared mentioned. And then it's about career readiness. How do we make sure the sailor is resilient, tough? Do we have the support for the families? Are we developing them as leaders? And when you look at the personnel system modernization, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more later in the panel, so I won't spend a lot of time up front, but we're using an industrial age model. For some in the audience who are of similar age to me, what we're using now is exactly what they used when we came in. And so we're taking those 55 different systems, 256 or so programs of record, none of which are interoperable, and we're collapsing them into one family. We're going to take it into the cloud. We're going to move it from behind the CAC card, and we're going to allow sailors to access their records, negotiate for orders, do their training from their own iPhone or mobile device. And so, and it's not just about the IT, it's also about the processes and the policies, and we didn't wait for IT to change that. Ready, relevant learning is the second pillar for Sailor 2025. It's all about a continuum of learning, and the way that I like to describe it, and you talked about it, Jared, for the Navy right now, the way we've been doing business is we give folks, you know, this much training, and they go to their ship. They use about half of that. And then about half of them stay in. And for the half that stay in, we have to give them the training over here all over again because the skills have atrophied, the technology has changed. They didn't use it in their first tour, and therefore we have to retrain them. So it makes no sense. And so the first piece part of Ready Relevant Learning is what we call block learning. We completed that at the end of last fiscal year. 54 of the ratings that are going through Ready Relevant Learning. There are some ratings like Nuke that really already have that model, like special operators that have different training models. But we finished blocking them to figure out where in their career did sailors need training, and therefore we cut some of that initial accession training down. In some cases we added it. It is about readiness, and we added it to different parts. Now we're into how do we deliver it differently. So it's content modernization. We know that they learn better by not having, Ferris Bueller's professor with PowerPoint slides. If I'm starting to sound like that, I apologize. But it's more about, can they do it better on a device? Can they do it better 3D? Can they do it better virtually? Do they do it better with an avatar, for instance, like our LCS trainer out in San Diego, where they learn an engine room with using an avatar in a computer lab. Then they go in and they do some of that virtually. Then we link them with their team, and we finish off in a mission module where they're doing the actual evolution required for that mission. That's where we're going. And again, I'm happy to talk more about some of those piece parts, but we're pretty excited about it. And the career readiness is all about how do we support them and make sure that they are resilient and tough. And the last thing that I'll mention there is as part of all this, when we look at Recruit Training Command and our sailors coming in through boot camp, we took what was about 60% PowerPoint slides and we turned that on its head, and it's now hands-on training, reps and sets for watch standing, for damage control, for firefighting, for actually standing watches and walking around and doing gauges. It sounds rudimentary, but when you get sailors that have been stressed as part of that with a crucible event at the end, when they get to the ship, they're a lot readier. And then it's on us to make sure that we keep refreshing that training at the right time, closer to the waterfront, sometimes in brick and mortar, sometimes not, and sometimes done on the ship. So looking forward to talking more about that.
All right, thank you, sir. General Worth.
Hey, first and foremost, thank you for having me here this morning. For Training Command and for the Marine Corps, the signing of and issuance of the National Defense Strategy in 2017 signaled that we're going to need to do some things differently in the Marine Corps. As we've emerged from the global war on terror, as we've emerged from many, many years now doing things that are not necessarily integrated with the Navy, we're returning to a world that is recognizable to those of us who have been around for 20 plus 30 years in terms of our relationship with the Navy. But the Commandant has also implored us to think differently about how we train and think differently about how we'll employ the force in a Marine Corps Force 2025 type of environment. One, that environment characterized by great power competition, characterized by a highly technical environment, a requirement to synchronize and link different types of technology, and then deliver force on the battlefield in ways that should be, if we're going to move in a revolutionary direction, should be completely different than how we've done this in the past 30 years, in order to truly rival a peer or near-peer competitor. So the Commandant has asked us, particularly myself at Training Command, and I have a partner at MAGTAF Training Command, Marine Air Ground Task Force Training Command, who is concerned with how we train in the live fire, exercise, live virtual constructive environment in the operational forces. For myself at Training Command, I have the responsibility for all of our entry-level MOS training, all of our career progression MOS training, and then advanced skills MOS training. So we have roughly 25,000 folks in the pipeline at any one point in time. But it is that finishing of every Marine being a rifleman that occurs within training command. They're recruited, they're trained at the depots, and then in training command, we provide them with their MOS training, making them all riflemen, and then providing them with their technical skill sets. Contemplating how we do that and thinking differently about how we train also means that we're looking very, very closely at what the Navy is doing with its relevant learning. In many ways, the Marine Corps benefits directly from their movement in that direction because 52% of our training in the Marine Corps actually occurs at other service schools for entry-level training. Air Force schools, Air Force bases, I should say, equipped and supported by Marines in the cadres, Army installations, Navy installations. 52% of our training actually occurs joint service installations. That's a big deal. So we watch very, very closely the movements in the direction of more technical, flipped classrooms, persistent learning environments, things of that nature that will allow us to not only introduce our entry-level Marines to their technical fields and their technical skills, but also entertains new methodologies for how we deliver that training. Training command is focused right now really on 3 pillars. We know that we need to continue to recruit and train great people. We also need to bring great people into the training environment as instructors. So back to the talent management aspects that Admiral Nowell just mentioned, we need to ensure that we have great people on the podium teaching, but they need to teach differently. We need to flip the classrooms and have the classrooms not be industrial age modeled, where the instructor is at the center of the universe, but now we need to flip the classroom so that the student becomes the center of that universe. The student has a persistent learning environment that is dynamic, that is enabled by technology, that allows the student to go into the environment, learn at a pace that they can learn at, reinforce the skill sets, better synthesize the information, and potentially overall reduce time to train in that environment. So we're focusing on the people first as the center of gravity, and then we focus secondly on the second pillar, which is technological innovation and equipment modernization in our classrooms. And for the Marine Corps, as I just told you, we have a lot of our schoolhouses that are actually located on other service installations, but within the Marine Corps we have old infrastructure that needs to be modernized, that needs to be better enabled to support the highly technical equipment and devices and those persistent learning environments that we've described. Internet access, Wi-Fi access, persistent, not purchased by the student in their barracks room, but existing just like it does on a college campus. Almost any college campus, you can walk aboard the college campus, and the students can access the internet from wherever they are on campus. In other words, if they want to learn, they can learn. If they want to move more rapidly through the information and the technical curricula, then they can do that at their pace. We should encourage that. That requires a shift, a revolutionary shift in how we've delivered training and education. And the Marine Corps is moving in that direction. And then finally, in terms of resourcing and budget, we need to think very, very, well, more distinctly about how we're going to not only implement some of these changes, but sustain them over time. For the Marine Corps, who spends a lot of its capital on new equipment and operationally focused enablers, we'll need to think a little bit differently about how we will implement and then sustain these new capabilities to actually achieve the environment that we want and the environment that we know we're going to need to fight in 2025. So I can provide you with some specific examples of how we're going about this change and how we're implementing this change and who we're watching in terms of what types of things the other services are learning. I'll be able to talk in more detail about those things during our question and answer session. So thank you.
Thank you, General. Admiral Penoyer.
Hey, good morning, and thanks. I'll make some remarks I think that are very consonant with Admiral Nowell and General Wirth. Just a couple of quick points, and then I'll tell you a little vignette that I think kind of brings to life what I want to convey. In the Coast Guard, we're compared to our DoD colleagues, our sister services, we're a relatively small force, but that leanness has allowed us, I'd say probably for about coming up on 2 decades now, to have really realigned our training philosophy to a performance-based training system. So much of Admiral Nowell's points, General Worth's points are spot on with our experience. We essentially have, at least through our formal training system, focused exclusively on the actual skills and tasks that are relevant at a particular career ladder, largely because it was economical and efficient for us to do so, not because we thought it was a great idea. But it turns out to be a wonderful idea. What I'll talk about today is not so much that performance-based training system, but really the interaction with the modern world. So I'm a fan of referring to the fourth industrial revolution, which I would loosely describe as being the convergence of computing power, sensors, and data analytics, big data. So you add those three things together in a networked world, and it's a substantively different operating environment than even the information technology world that we previously were still coming to grips with. And so let me just give you a vignette that kind of illustrates what that environment means. One of our boutique schools, a core competency of the Coast Guard, is surf operations. And we have a boutique exquisite training center, the Motor Lifeboat School out at Cape Disappointment on the West Coast, where we conduct some of the highest risk training that we do anywhere in the Coast Guard. Essentially, we teach people how to operate in breaking bar surf, and part of that, as you can imagine, is an intensely focused performance-based training for the coxswains. The punchline of the fourth industrial revolution for me is that it has democratized capability at a level that I don't think we're all well suited to acknowledge and adapt to. The Motor Lifeboat School, for example, leveraging a testbed program for a small UAS, commercially off-the-shelf UAS testbed. Let's see what we can do with it. They jumped into that at the Motor Lifeboat School. The enlisted crew at the Motor Lifeboat School qualified with FAA certification to pilot these things and began using them as videography capability for the performance of these boats in surf. There's some limitations. Right now the commercial UAS have difficulties operating more than 20 knots of wind, and as you can imagine, we like it when it's worse than that for our training purposes. But the real-time videography, essentially, you click the follow me on your cell phone. The UAS brings high-def videography that moves with the small boat through the surf. That videography is immediately uploaded to the computer back at the schoolhouse. By the time the guys take off their dry suits and come back up to debrief what just happened in training, they've used off-the-shelf technology to edit what I would describe as a highlights reel, but it's actually much more intensely focused on the performance. What was the standard? How did you do that? Why did you make this decision? How did you apply those decision rules? And they literally get a debrief with a level of fidelity that we've never seen before. It recently occurred as an example of where the fourth IR has taken us, that at one of these debriefs, there was, the instructor said, well, geez, I really would love to talk more about this, but I don't have that. And lest you think this is a young person's dynamic only, one of the more experienced, more senior officers in charge, senior enlisted guy or gal of my era in the room said, oh, no problem, flicked open his smartphone and airdropped that file to the instructor, and it was on the screen in under 15 seconds. I tell you this story because it has made a dramatic difference in the feedback cycle, the OODA loop results for the trainee, but also because it kind of illustrates the fact that our waterfall project management approach to both technology, deployment of systems, acquisition and use of them in the field, and our design of training is effectively being outmoded by the reality of the operating environment. And so I've become a fan of trying to describe where we are and where we're going, strictly in terms of the idea of moving to an agile development cycle and the challenge that presents to a military organization. One of my colleagues was reflecting on it this morning and said, it's really difficult to brief your boss when you don't have an end-to-end project plan with a great cost estimate. What you have is the first cycle, and we don't know where this is going, and it's going to make a difference for our folks in the field. It takes a whole new paradigm for how we acquire and deploy capability, how we design our training system, and I'm really excited about where it's headed. But if you look at the Motor Lifeboat School as an example, everything I just told you was done under exceptions to the rules. Nothing they did there was, I'm going to say, organizationally intentional. And that's the lesson to learn from where we're at in the training system today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Morris.
Military Sealift Command operates its ships primarily with civilian personnel. We're part of the Department of the Navy. Some of the ships are operated by private sector companies under contract to MSC. Some of them we operate ourselves. We have a civilian workforce development strategy that focuses on self-development first, and then organizational leader development, and then enterprise-wide perspectives for our people. I see probably the biggest change at Military Sealift Command, and I think probably in the commercial maritime industry, is increasing use of simulators. Our partners use them. Our partners have them. We use them for, especially for officer training. Our partners use them for non-officer training as well. We, for instance, going to have 14 high-speed aluminum catamarans with water jet propulsion. Coast Guard requirements for those people, for all the officers, require that they have classroom time, simulator time, and the simulator has to be an exact replica of the bridge on a high-speed vessel, and also requires them to have 14 actual entries and departures from ports in daytime and nighttime. There's practical elements there. There is classroom. There's simulator time. We're going to get some new towing and salvage ships. They're going to be dynamic positioning system equipped, like some of the OSVs in the offshore oil industry are. We're going to have our people certified by an outside certifying organization actually to operate those things. And that requires classroom time, it requires simulator time, and it requires loads of actual onboard time. We're in the position where not all of our people we get are green when we first get them. We require them to hold the Coast Guard credential for the position that they're actually applying for. But we're also responsible for their upward development after that. The maritime training schools and other schools and the maritime academies all focus very heavily, not just on classroom, but practical, actual wrench turning and getting in there and having people do things. We have a couple of training facilities ourselves. We share Fleet Training Center San Diego with the active duty side. We actually have a training facility in New Jersey. We're going to relocate to Fort Eustis, where we also already have some things installed there. We have an unrepped training facility actually in Little Creek, very much focused on hands-on. Yes, there's a little bit of classroom component, but very much hands-on. Go out and run the rigs. We've even had some partner or nations from Europe and from Canada actually come to our unrepped probe maintenance course. And I asked my people, how did they even find out about it? And he said, well, it's word of mouth. But it's very much, that's a course where you are taught how to take it apart, how to clean it, how to fix it, how to put it back together again. But I would say, in addition to the use of simulation increasingly, our biggest emphasis, I would say, in the last 2 years is preparing for operations in a contested environment and beefing up our training in that area. Some of the maritime academies have varying amounts of naval science courses they have to take before we hire some of their graduates as officers. Some come to us ex-Navy, actually. Some are retired or former surface warfare officers or senior chief quartermasters in the Navy or enginemen or things like that. They do very well. But what we've found basically is that some of the skills, the high-level warfare skills had atrophied. Some of the emission control time, I guess you could say, actually it hadn't been that great over the last 15 years when we didn't have much in the way of a near-peer competitor, now we do. So we've developed an in-house naval operations basic course that we're running. We've run about 85% of our deck officers through it, including our masters. And we've also developed a second classified course for a second week that we're going to roll out very soon. We've already run a beta test of that course. Some of our private sector partners have expressed interest in getting their facilities cleared to teach that second week course for some of the, so that the crews and some of our privately operated ships under contract will have the same level of expertise so they can work well with the Navy fleet and make sure that in a future war they can survive and perform their mission and minimize their likelihood of getting sunk. I think in addition, Military Sea Lift Command is reaching out to organizations like the Naval Warfare Development Centers and DARPA in a way that we'd never have before, and it's influencing some of our training, actually. And I think that's about all for my opening statement.
All right. Again, please feel free to approach the microphones if any of you have questions, but I'm happy to get us started. Let's start with this. I think it's probably important to acknowledge that technology is not going to solve everything here, right? So, for example, I would be surprised if you guys shut down all your small arms ranges and started doing all of your weapons quals on first-person shooter video games. So what's the right way to think about which types of training are most conducive to, you know, an app-based solution or a technology-enabled solution, and which ones are not?
I'll go ahead and begin there. With the entry-level pipeline, as you might expect, we have that challenge. That is the question that we're asking ourselves right now. Where is it that we can leverage technology? How is it we'll leverage that technology to speed learning and to ensure that our Marines have the skills that they need? Because we have this wide spectrum of huge variance in the type of training. We have everything from aviation mechanics, hydraulics, ejection seat mechanics, to infantry, O3XX Marine who probably needs to be in the field, learning to use his map, his compass, learning how heavy his equipment is, learning the field craft that he's actually going to need or she's going to need in order to be a successful infantry Marine. So the question, the study of where it is technology can be leveraged and how it is we'll apply technology, that is ongoing right now. And for the last 2 years, we've conducted a number of studies and experiments to see just how much we can leverage technology and where it'll be applied. For the Marine Corps, and if there's any Marines in the room, you'll recognize this, anytime someone starts talking about moving to technology-based and leaving the field, Marines become afraid, right? That's a change. There is no substitute for carrying a heavy load and being in the field. Right. There is no substitute for knowing exactly how much torque needs to be applied to a bolt when you're repairing an engine. Simulations can go so far. So what we're looking at is the blend, the integration of simulations, where it matters, where it can speed learning. In Pensacola, where we train our aviation maintainers, they are using equipment and engine simulations and white gear simulators to allow an instructor from a control center to train 30 Marines, mechanics, on a piece of equipment. He can then introduce 30 different challenges, 30 different fails or errors into the system while the Marines are working on the simulators. He can train them at a rate and in a different way that plays to their strengths, mitigates their weaknesses, and allows them to get the set and reps required so that when they do go to the hangar and they work on an actual piece of white gear, then they are that much more effective when they actually put their hands on the system. They've had hundreds of reps, whereas if he only trained on the actual equipment in the hangar, he's got to deal with safety issues, he's got to deal with POL issues, he's got to deal with equipment that runs or does not run, and you have 8 students with hands-on equipment and 22 students standing around watching. In those ways, we know that there are certain MOSs where, as a matter of fact, our studies have revealed that we know that we can use simulators in at least 25 different MOSs that'll significantly enhance and speed training. Conversely, we know that there is no substitute for taking infantry Marines out to the field, having them sweat, breathe hard, then try to employ their weapon systems, go through the sets and reps, because that's the environment that they work in. So there's a little bit of variance, but that is the study. That is the challenge when you look at the entire spectrum of how it is we'll employ technology. But we do know that there is great utility in moving in this direction. I told you that right now we have 25,000 folks in the training command enterprise. 18,000 of those are students, and anywhere between 2,500 to sometimes 5,000 of those Marines are awaiting training. Because of the industrial age model, they're waiting on a classroom to become available for an instructor to deliver information. Throughput is limited by our construct. That is what we're trying to break down. That's the change. And from a business perspective, think of 2,500 folks who are getting paid, but they're not actually in training as you would like them to be. Great utility, great application, but there's a couple different examples of how we would see the change being implemented.
Admiral, you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I may, I'm as with Admiral Nowell's comments about basic training, I'm in violent agreement. The revolution that the Coast Guard went through when we shifted to performance-based training was when you think about knowledge, skills, abilities, and attitudes, we took the knowledge piece largely out of the face-to-face delivery realm, right? That was our enormous savings. We saved contact time for those times when we needed over-the-shoulder training. And there's a bunch of reasons why you would want that, but I would direct your attention to attitudes. Attitudes, as in recruit training, don't shift through electronic means. It's been repeatedly studied and proven. That's not how you get where you want to be. And similarly, the application to the real world, as General Wirth just talked about, that's not something that happens electronically either. You can dramatically improve the success rates, but I think the thing that I find most intriguing about technology right now is we've been focused a little bit on experiential learning, right? So people don't just learn when you deliver them a training environment. They learn every day in a continuously reinforced learning environment of their day-to-day job. And I think that where technology is interesting to me is in its ability to recognize and capture some of what is happening there, and then we know who you are and what you've done and what you know, what you're proficient at, and I can therefore tailor your additional training to what you need to come to the standard we require for you to go do the next job. That's exciting. Yeah. It's also really hard. Yeah. If it was easy, we'd have done it already. But it's the challenge ahead of us of being really, it's about being effective for the folks in the field, but it's also about being effective for the taxpayer. I think Admiral Nowell talked about this. We cannot afford to train you, have you not used the training, and then have to train you again 2 years later for something. The taxpayer can't afford that.
Yeah. And let me jump in because exactly on the same sheet of music, and to your last point, we're shifting now to this being more, in our case, right, for a sailor-centered continuum of learning. And as you said, it's easier to say it than to do it. So ready, relevant learning is our path. When you look at some of the training that General Wirth talked about, that's a joint training school. What he described is what we call mobile reconfigurable training system. And when you look at the kind of savings that you get in qualification times, I'll give you one stat, and then I want to tell you the path that we're going down. So for the Virginia class Caterpillar diesel training, we incorporated that into our machinist mate A-school pipeline in 2015. And when we looked at the qualification times for 12 Virginia-class submarines before and after, the students who completed the course qualified on an average 117 days faster than those who had the older curriculum. So we've got, and I could go through, many other stats across other warfare areas. So we know that this blended solution that General Wirth described, reps and sets so that it's not foreign to you when you then actually lay your hands on the diesel, works. And right, it's the way we all do stuff. If I want to change a bike tire, then I go and pull up the YouTube video and I look at it about 3 times, and then I call my wife and she comes and she helps me change the bike tire. But but it's the way they're doing things anyway now. But let's get after how do we track that. So first of all, you do need some foundation. And for us, what that means as part of our foundation is that we want an authoritative data environment. That's a fancy way for saying we want a data lake, okay? And we want to know everything about you. We want to have your sailor resume in there, and we want it easily accessible across our force development and force management pillars for how we manage that talent. And then when we bring you in, some of the technology we're pursuing, we have an initiative called PAL, the Personal Assistant for Lifelong Learning. So it knows what training you've had, it knows what experience in the civilian world and in the military world, it knows your credentials and qualifications, and then using artificial intelligence and man-machine teaming, we can then pace that training, we can deliver it in different ways. Oh, by the way, we can use it as that sailor takes that tablet with them. Oh, by the way, not behind a CAC card, but enabled by multi-factor authentication going into the cloud. You can use it wherever you're at. Then I get a prompt that says, hey, your certification on X, Y, or Z from a proficiency standpoint is going to lapse. You need to do this refresher module. And you can do it online, but then you're going to have to go in to, maybe a brick and mortar that we have on the waterfront close to a ship, could be actually on a ship, okay, or at a squadron or with a unit to then refresh. That's what we want to get to, and the AI is there now. Industry is using it, and I would maintain that we're lagging a little bit, but we're working pretty hard to catch up.
All right, thank you all. Let's go out to the audience. Start over here.
Hi, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. I wanted to ask about some of the higher end trainer opportunities. Admiral Nowell, you mentioned the LCS trainer, which I hear is top notch. There's also the SEAT trainer, the Air and Missile Defense and ASW trainer. So I was wondering where the services are willing to make those kind of top notch investments in really exquisite facilities versus where you look to apply technology in sort of a lower cost manner that Admiral Penoyer talked about.
I apologize. I got about 2/3 of
Yeah,
that
Megan,
question
can you try
with the
again a little closer to
acoustics
the
in
mic?
room.
It's tough to hear.
And it
through the
wasn't your
speakers.
fault. I'm
Sorry.
just old.
The acoustics in this room are really bad. Just curious what areas you're willing to make investments in the very high-end exquisite trainers versus where you look for lower-end, lower-cost solutions.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and start. For the Marine Corps, when we buy exquisite systems, I don't know that there's much of a challenge. There's not going to be any risk taken with the Joint Strike Fighter or the simulators or all of the mechanism that actually make that system work. We have to train, you have to sustain in order to employ the capability. The exquisite systems for the Marine Corps aren't really the issue. It is making less exquisite systems more ubiquitous in the training pipeline to find those efficiencies. It gets back to cost value proposition. It is hard to, without the data lake and the studies, it's hard to explain or to make your argument for why you need to make an investment and why we need to make a leap at the lower end of the spectrum. For instance, our bulk fuelers can, in simulation, set up a forward arming refueling point in simulation, from choosing the hose, laying the hose, connecting the hoses. They can do all those things in simulation. LAV repair technicians can repair, take down an engine, repair the LAV, and in simulation they can go into the detail of applying thread lock to a particular bolt. You can do those types of things, but the systems aren't necessarily ubiquitous. The classrooms haven't been adapted to fully leverage everything that we've talked about. They exist, but we're simply not exploiting all of the capabilities because we're limited by some of the brick and mortar institutions, that we simply haven't adapted the facilities to really move dynamically in that environment. So I would tell you, for the Marine Corps, we take no risk with the exquisite systems. That's not the challenge. The challenge is that 15,000 folks who aren't working on developing a skill to work on one of those exquisite systems. It's the big bulk of the population that are just doing normal things that right now are getting done. There isn't part of the challenge is that we're not missing mission in terms of producing Marines of a particular MOS. It's really, really hard to argue for change when you don't have a problem. But what we're trying to explain here is that there is an opportunity to make the leap, and certainly if we're going to scale, if we're going to be able to scale at some point in time in the future in order to meet, to grow the force dynamically, particularly if it's highly technical, how do you do that if you haven't laid the groundwork and if you don't have the facilities and you haven't set up an architecture, persistent learning environments, et cetera, that will make all these things possible? So I would tell you from the Marine Corps, not much risk with the high-end, hugely expensive systems, and a lot of status quo and a lot of proponency for status quo where we can save money on the lower end of things.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think, you know, you have to spend money to save money. So when you look at some of the training systems we've talked about, and again, it's a full gamut, right? It's everything from, you know, the smart tablet that I give the EOD students at the joint EOD school. Well, guess what? If that knocks attrition down, which we can show by 3%, we spend a lot of money attracting that kind of a person, and then we send them through schools before they get to that. So you save money across the supply chain when you look at how you bring folks in and train them. You then save money if I can in the morning at submarine school have a MERT system where it's a Virginia class radio room, and then in 30 minutes over lunch they convert it to be the torpedo room, and they're getting those reps and sets. That is much cheaper than the way that we're doing it. And then you mentioned the SIATS trainer, which is the Combined Integrated Air and Missile Defense and ASW trainer. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but this idea of integrated training, we're doing the same thing as we look at some of our maritime, maritime safety and seamanship training, our MSTC centers that we're bringing online, where we not only do the bridge crew, but with the Combat Information Center. If you think about it, if I have to spend $500 million to repair a guided missile destroyer after a collision, it's much cheaper, even though it's high-end training systems that are not inexpensive to put that money in on the front end. The rationale, though, and the reason is the readiness and the war-fighting capability and the safety of those crews. And so I will tell you, the Navy is all in with doing it, and it's a little bit different model, but we're going full bore.
If I can just add one quick comment, I would say that in some regards, your question boils down to, do you buy the many cheap or the few expensive systems? And I would suggest that perhaps that is a question based in the old paradigm. In my experience, and I think largely what you heard here is constant in that what we're dealing with is a circumstance in which the real revolution is in tailoring to the learner. And so that will reserve the use of these, as you call them, exquisite capabilities for those things which require that. There is no team-based training that I can deliver to you remotely through a cheap application that's going to form a ship's navigational crew. I need that environment, and where we can do things there on a simulator that are either safer or give you more opportunity than you could possibly have by doing it on your ship or without a simulator, we're going to invest in that. But the real paradigm is, let's use that capability where the learners need it, rather than because that's the only way we know to deliver the full box set. That's the revolution that's occurring.
I'll also just mention, and I'm extrapolating a little bit on your question, but if you think about some of the weapons systems that we're bringing online now, and you think about how we train to use them, this issue of going live, virtual, constructive, you have to do it. One, we don't have ranges where you can do it. It's too expensive sometimes to link up the different elements, whether it's across coast or even on the same coast. And then in some cases, we don't want the adversary to see what we're training to, right? So while we're talking more on the individual and kind of team training at a basic and perhaps intermediate level. When you start getting to advanced, it's getting those capabilities, actually getting them on board, in our cases, the ships or the aircraft, so that you can put that whole force together. It's not the topic of this panel, but for the Navy, and I would argue for the Joint Force, what we're calling distributed maritime operations, and as we're doing this dynamic force employment, it demands that you approach that training and the readiness generation and the certification in a different way.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Let's go over to this side of the room, sir.
Commander Matt Shell, can you hear me? Is that good? Okay. My question is, Admiral Nowell mentioned the industrial age model of education, and I think many of us in this room are aware of the weaknesses of that model, but one of the strengths is that when you have active duty personnel, maybe on 24-month tours rotating through, it doesn't take a lot to train them. You know, you can hand them a lesson plan and some static training aids and they can go. Whereas more active methods or methods that rely on advanced simulators or electronic methods require a more well-trained instructor base that's aware of instructional design methods and a more persistent staff presence to maintain those methods. I think we've all experienced, you know, someone made a great simulator product, but then it wasn't maintained and it just atrophied and became out of date or something. So I'm curious about the panel's experiences with the challenges on the staff and infrastructure side of establishing these modern programs, and then you know, how you've overcome those challenges.
Did you get that?
I did. Well, we'll start with building what we will describe as a learning ecosystem. And that ecosystem that's going to consist of many of the things we've already talked about. You know, the flipped classroom, which is the shift from industrial age to information age technology, student-centered rather than being instructor-centered. You have blended learning, guided discussions, adaptive, you know, technology that is adaptive to the learner. When you build this type of environment, you'll also need to think more distinctly about who it is you bring into the environment. So there will be a requirement to take a look at who you have serve as on instructor duty. Maybe it isn't good enough just to have, hey, you're wearing a uniform, I can assign you to be an instructor just because I need to detail somebody into the slot. We'll need to think very, very deliberately about how we make instructors, how we train basic instructors to become master instructors using and leveraging the technology that's available to them. There's a vetting requirement. It is, again, part of the shift in how we think about training. It does require a paradigm shift. If we want folks to train Marines, sailors, airmen in a highly technical environment, then we need to think about how it is we enable instructors and who it is we assign to instructor duty. So there's a paradigm shift, but building the learning ecosystem so that it is not binary, it isn't an all or nothing proposition, it'll be an environment in which a good instructor who has been vetted can go and thrive because the model itself is designed to train an instructor from being a basic instructor to being a master instructor who can fully leverage all of the capability and all of the systems that are in the ecosystem. Yeah. So we are looking very distinctly at how we go about putting folks onto the duty and then expecting them to produce what it is we want them to produce for 2025 Marine.
Yeah, and the instructor doesn't go away. I will tell you, as a surface warfare officer, I watched when for many well-meaning reasons, you know, we went away from SWAS in the early 2000s and we went to computer-based training. Ready relevant learning is not a repeat of that. And I think the general got it just right. And I would tell you it's about being a master in your warfighting area. So for the Navy, we have learning centers, right, by warfighting area. Think surface warfare officer school, submarine school. But for each of the communities, we have that. And we have instituted programs now beyond just the aviation community as you look at WITIs, our warfare tactics instructors, where we'll use them not only in the classroom, but we'll also then populate our ships think about the power of having a surface witty as a department head on each ship as you're doing some of the kind of training that we're talking about. So in none of this, I think, what I want folks to make the assumption that because we're going to leverage technology, do it in different manners, make it a little bit more sailor-centric in some of the individual training, and some of that is qualifications, right, and certifications. As you look at the high-end training, the instructor is going to be, right there in many cases over the shoulder. And the last thing that I'd mention there is, and we'll learn, we will make mistakes, or we'll decide that we want to do it in a different manner. And a great example of that is what the Surface Force has done recently as we looked at how our afloat training groups were delivering training in that advanced phase. And it used to be train the trainer, and then you leave the ship, and then the trainers, will go ahead and train the rest of the crew. Well, when we fight a ship, we're going to have the A team as the condition 1 watch standers. Well, they were the training team, so we turned that around, and now when they come aboard, they train those watch teams. That's who they certify. So you want the pros from Dover to be the ones that are really doing the hands-on, watching the folks behind the scopes, et cetera. Did that answer your question, though?
Yes, for the most part. The only other part I was interested in is sort of the staff, and maybe even the answer is civilian presence, to maintain electronic products like simulators, like computer-based training. In my experience, active duty folks on a 24-month tour often just don't have the instructional experience or intuition to really develop good computer-based training products or deal with all the logistics challenges and IT challenges of maintaining simulators. So I'm just curious if you've run into that sort of thing as well.
I'll just,
please.
I'll give you 3, sir.
All right. Yeah. In my experience, the best time to address this is during the acquisition of the hardware system. That's probably when you can make the best case for that sort of investment, and it's a relatively small expense when you can compare it to all the hardware you're buying. We were lucky in the EPF acquisition. That was going to be a joint program for both the Army and the Navy. And the Army ended up buying an EPF bridge simulator, exact replica, as I said, of the actual vessels, and engine control console simulator as well. And you need to actually have a life cycle maintenance plan for the simulation hardware. Army just recently told us, MSC, we're going to be updating our simulator software, actually, because they have other simulators for themselves as well, for their watercraft operators. And they said, MSC would like about a high 6-figure contribution from you for the cost for your portion. So I would say that's part of it. The other thing is, actually, I just mentioned, going back to the other question for a minute, too, we mentioned applications, what apps, phone apps can be used for training. I just want to remind everyone that you may be able to use phone apps for training, and I think that phone apps would be great for things like what CNP is using it for things like for communicating with your detail or your assignment preferences and your training preferences. But in a contested environment at sea, my understanding is if you turn on a phone, you could be dead. So whatever solution we develop for training, it can't be a solution or a system that relies upon something that if you turn it on in a contested environment, you'll end up having a missile dropping on you from space.
Yeah, and I guess I would, turning a little bit to the personnel side of it, the training system side of it, I guess I would give you 3 real quick thoughts. The first is distributed learning is nothing new, right? So we've been doing distributed learning, blended learning for a long time, and we've learned a lot. And one of the things we've learned is that there was a false belief, and I hope we can lay this to rest today. If it's never been killed off before, let's do it today. It doesn't save you instructional staff. In fact, there's countless study after study that shows you need more and different. The student to instructor ratio is higher, and the contact nature is different. It's harder, right? So you need different people. There's a reason that these things, I called it a revolution, and the revolution presents several challenges to us. One is this question of what is that instructional workforce being trained to do? Who are you picking? How do you get to that? We talked about that a little bit. A couple of these things is that as we move to this tailored training that knows who you are and is responsive to what operators are seeing in the field, here's just a couple of examples from our initial work here. We recognize the tailored system that is built around what you need to know to meet the standard is going to require us to completely revisit the industrial processing plant that we call training. You might drop into modular weeks while the course is in mid-progress, and we may have revolving graduation on a weekly or daily basis, depending on where you're completed. Everything I just said about that is exponentially hard to execute at a training center for the over-the-shoulder part. We're just take for granted we've taken everything off of the student that we can let them do at their own pace, and we're only focused on that narrow area. Those are very difficult structural things to do, and really I bundle all this together, technology and the personal piece, under moving to an agile development and agile delivery model. It's hard, and it's not going to get easier unless we start by the principle, as you said, from design and acquisition, that we're going to operate this as an agile system. We're going to adapt what the content of that simulator is to what operators are seeing in the field. That means we're going to be revising content not on a triennial cycle, but on the next spiral, which might be a 3-week sprint. That's new, and that's really hard.
And the person in the uniform is going to be standing next to the person that's doing the agile development, right? So it's not, and that's where we get it wrong sometimes. That if you don't have the customer, the operator, there next to the person that can actually do the code and do it agilely, then you're going to fail. You can't just toss it over the transom and expect to get what you want without very actively being involved. And sometimes we're not all that great at the requirements generation process, but I think we're getting better with that.
And so, a final point, back to continuity. That civilian manpower budget that we all have, and we have to be much, much better about understanding what it is we have with regard to resourcing, what it is the requirement demands in order to be sustainable. We're looking at all of those things, but to your point, continuity matters. That civilian and uniformed mechanism that underpins everything that we're talking about has to be there, and that's where the continuity is going to come from. That's where your professionalization of the instructional cadres is going to come from. It takes experts to do curriculum analysis, curriculum development, again, manage agile systems. You need continuity, and that can't be on a 24-month cycle and be successful.
All right, we're down to our last 10 minutes, so this may have to be our last one. We'll see how we do. Sir.
Panel, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and service, what you do. Kevin Tokarski, Maritime Administration in the U.S. Department of Transportation. As services talk about the reliance on the fourth component, our industry partners, and as they really kind of progress into the battle space, there's training requirements that end up falling on our civilian providers. And that. Could you talk a little bit about to what degree you're involved with that, or how you see that evolving, and the challenges that presents for you?
Want me to go first? Please. We don't have as much money as, say, CNP for investments in training and things like that. So we have to leverage actually a lot of the capital investments that our commercial partners have already made. We may not get, say, like $30 million for like 6 new simulators, but we'll leverage, for instance, some of the commercial union school simulator facilities, training facilities, schools. We also leverage surflance simulators. We've run some simulations recently through a lot of our new masters involving an operation called Corp in November, just to kind of build up some confidence and also get better at it actually without actually bending or putting holes in steel. But that's another solution for at least for smaller organizations, or if you want to do something your own, you can't get a quota with the Department of Navy. There are training vendors out there in the commercial sector that we use. So we use Navy quotas as well. We send people to engineering technical schools, very hands-on at some of the commercial union schools, as well as private vendors. I know a number of years ago, the Navy amphibious community and some of the LSDs were sending a lot of the enlisted people in the engineering ratings to one of the union engineering schools because they needed additional hands-on training in wrench turning and actual repairing, working with teammates. So that's another opportunity I said that we leverage just because we're never going to have as much money as some other organizations, and we're never going to get the quotas necessarily that we need as well because we're often, frankly, a lower priority. There's higher strategic priorities for the Navy.
So I would say from a Coast Guard perspective, one of the aspects of the paradigm revolution that I think is most exciting to me is this idea that you should be less concerned with courses and more concerned with experiential learning objects. So think of it as a micro module. This is something we've learned from industry, quite candidly. This is the state of the industry in the outside world. And there are opportunities and challenges that attend to this way of constructing tailored learning. One of the things we've learned through our partnership with the Department of Defense in developing these courses over the years is that unless you are very mindful in the way you build each one of these objects, when you assemble a course, it's pretty bumpy, right? So it can be very different in look and tone and feel and manner of testing unless you're careful. But the opportunity, for example, the U.S. Coast Guard right now, the opportunity is enormous. The U.S. Coast Guard right now is involved in really a stem-to-stern review of the way we prepare our marine inspection workforce. First big look I think that we've done, well, certainly in decades, maybe ever. Really huge look at it. If we can deal with some of those challenges in those experiential learning objects, right, there's enormous opportunity because the commercial sector, the commercial maritime sector has developed those learning objects. If we can work it out, there's enormous opportunity.
I think we can squeeze one more in if we're quick. Go ahead, sir.
I'm going to dummy it down because I'm a dinosaur. The MTs, mandatory trainings that we all have to suffer through every year after year after year after year. Two items. Number one, is there still any move afoot to try and remove or decrease those? And number two, along service lines, I know that when I went from a Coast Guard assigned to a naval unit, I had to take the same sexual harassment training module twice, once with Coast Guard people in uniform and one with Navy. Is there any cross-training or any move to look at, I mean, even qualifications on an M16 are different from each of the three services. It's the same firearm.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take your second question first, and then turn it over, if that's okay, Jared. So one of the things that the Navy has, and we're actually doing it jointly, is what we call credentialing opportunities online. So we take those certifications. Oh, by the way, it was originally designed to map it kind of across the Navy, the military, to make sure that we kind of understood, so we didn't do that kind of thing. And then to allow you to use the credentials certifications in the Navy when you got out so that you could map them. We're actually now also, mapping those certifications or credentials in the civilian world, and as we look at reservists or others who might come in, to then see where we might use them. So yeah, we are certainly trying not to do something right that makes no common sense.
And I understand that going to the civilian world, but even just between services, the Navy doesn't acknowledge the Coast Guard doesn't acknowledge the Navy.
So,
Yeah, no.
so that's a really large problem, right?
Yeah.
Because we're still in the process of really developing the ability to understand the individual learner, right? So even within our Coast Guard family, we don't know as much as we really need to know about the individual learner, what their experiences are, what their training has been, what their cycles are, all that sort of stuff, right? So then you magnify that problem because our ambition is exactly as you said, to be able to share that experience across in the joint environment, right? Because everything you just said makes perfect sense. I would say that is the difference between the IT, the third industrial revolution, the IT world, and the fourth. We're not there yet. That revolution is breaking. The crust is broken already in the outside world, but I think across the services, I would tell you that is the exact challenge that we are all working on now.
Thank you. And I'll just add, Military SEAL Command, we hire trainers, and we want our people to have either Coast Guard certified training status for delivering maritime training, or if you actually are a certified Navy instructor, complete all the Navy training instructor requirements, we'll accept that as well. That's what we're doing in that area. But that brings me to another topic. I'm just going to use your question as a segue. The Coast Guard, the Navy, Maritime Administration, and to a certain extent Military SEALs Command have worked hard to actually get people in the sea services credit for their military experience,
Right.
so it could translate into credentials for the merchant marine or even just driving a water taxi. And it's been a painful crosswalk, and there's gaps here and there that have been identified, and I think the industry is going to be looking to I think the government will be looking to the industry union schools and some other commercial vendors to probably develop some gap closure courses. But I said that's an example of an attempt actually to get the different services, the Navy and the Coast Guard, to work together, not necessarily for active duty to active duty, but just active duty to civilian. And it is not a simple process, but it has the potential to actually provide a strategic reserve of civilian manpower to get the Army to war, actually, because the Army, 90% of the Army stuff is going to go on Navy ships or MARAD ships under Military SEALs Command operational control.
If I may just throw one more thing to throw on your radar, and that is take the civilian set, and whereas the civilian, taking the military skill and making it acknowledged by the civilians is the current push. I would say look at your reserve forces and acknowledge their civilian skills and somehow or another put it into the military. Master's degree, lifetime teaching credential, fire service instructor, none of it acknowledged either by Navy or Coast Guard because that was civilian training. We don't acknowledge it. You have to take the courses here.
Yeah, amen.
All right, I think you're just getting agreement here, which is good because we're out of time. Great panel. Thank you very much, everyone, for the good discussion, and please help me thank our panelists.